Hi everyone and welcome back to the Chess on Ice Basic Curling Strategy course. We're up to lesson 3 now. If you've been following along, last lesson we talked about how you should play differently when you have the lead and when you're behind in a game. So for today, what we're going to do is talk about how you should play differently when you have the hammer or when you don't. This is the other major strategic consideration that goes into every end and really every shot you're going to call. So it's a very important thing to wrap your mind around how the game should be played differently based on whether you have the last shot or not in a given end. Before we jump into the lesson, I just want to take a second to talk about my Patreon. The Chess on Ice Patreon is a great way to support this channel if you're enjoying it, and comes with a variety of benefits from getting to see videos early to access to exclusive videos and having your names in the credits. If you're interested, I will throw a link to the Patreon in the description down below this video. With that out of the way, let's take a quick look at how we want to play ends differently based on whether or not we have the last shot in an end. We'll start with talking about the strategy considerations that go into not having the hammer. In other words, when you're throwing first. As you may already know, the team that throws first almost always plays right to the center line from the first shot of the end. Now, if you're new to curling, you might be wondering why this is. Or maybe you're not. It is sort of the logical thing to do the first time you look at a curling game, right? Let's go right to the bullseye or right to the pin in the case of curling and stake our claim to the best real estate on the board. Things aren't that simple in curling, obviously, but for the team without hammer, they often are. We want to play down the center line and as close to the button as possible. Of course, curling strategy isn't that simple, but when you're playing without the hammer, it kind of is. You really want to play as close to the button and the forefoot as possible when you don't have the last shot. The reason is pretty simple. If you want to score or even threaten to score, you're going to have to get something near the pin and have it in a position where it is not open to be hit, at least not easily. Why is that? Well, to put it simply, the team with the last rock gets to go last, right? So with the hammer, if they have the opportunity to simply hit one of your open rocks out to score, they'll probably do that, right? You expect them to make that shot. Secondarily, if you have a protected rock that's not near the button, not near the pin, then they're very likely to be able to outdraw your rock. So we want to play near the pin and get whatever we get near the pin, usually under a guard, to either steal the end, meaning we would score a point or more, or at least to force our opponents to take only 1 point. For instance, here we have a center guard. If we throw a rock to, say, the top of the forefoot, that doesn't necessarily mean we will steal, but if that rock stays there, it's going to be very hard for our opponents to score multiple points. Even if they outdraw us once, it's going to be pretty tough for them to do so twice. There's not a lot of room to score, and there's certainly not a lot of room to come around our rock and still score. So they may be forced just to outdraw us in their last shot, or if they are somehow able to bury one in there, we may be able to follow it down to either steal or close the scoring area down so much that they can't score. If you watched the last video, you'll know that throwing rocks into the house and hitting are more conservative plays, while throwing up guards are more aggressive. That's true without the hammer just as much as it is with the hammer. You have a lot of control over the tenor of an end when you go first. You get to essentially set the tempo with your first rock, at least to a certain extent. There are 2 common ways to start without the hammer. First, as we see here, is to throw a rock right to the top of the forefoot. This can play out a couple different ways depending on what the hammer team wants to do, but already you've taken some of the aggressiveness out of the end, potentially, by throwing a rock into the house instead of throwing a guard. If the hammer team hits that rock, well, chances are there's not going to be very much in play this end, right? They hit, you weren't interested in throwing a guard, so chances are you'll hit back, and we may get an end that plays out until someone makes a mistake, or the hammer team either takes one or blanks. Often, though, you'll be throwing this rock when you already have a pretty good lead in a game. In that case, it's more likely for the hammer team to throw up a corner guard where they attempt to play aggressively for at least 2 points while you try to hold on to what's in the center of the sheet and either prevent them from scoring at all or hold them to a single point. The other option, which is often seen as the default option for the team without the hammer, is to just throw up a center guard with your first rock. This guard comes with a couple of benefits. First, it naturally brings the play to the center line, which is where you'd like to play. If the hammer team wants to play somewhat aggressively, but they don't want to go crazy and throw up a second guard right away, they will often just come right around your rock and try to bury one in the forefoot. That's not a bad shot at all for the hammer team, of course. It does give them an opportunity to play for two, to play for a deuce, because they've buried a rock, and again, they get to go last, right? However, if you can follow that rock down again, we're back in the kind of position we said we wanted in the first place. A very tight scoring area right around the center of the ice. One of two things is likely to happen here. One, we may eventually get rid of that red rock and threaten to steal. Or two, we may force red to a single point unless they take a lot of risks to try to clarify the center, open it up, and then expand the scoring area again. Either way, we're pretty happy with that. In most cases, unless we absolutely need to steal, we're very happy as long as we've set up a situation like this where a big end is unlikely. Now, of course, if we're way behind in the game, the hammer team probably won't play along with us and might just throw a rock out to the wings, or in the extreme late game, just throw through, right? In that case, we've still done something to get the play towards the center and put us in position to potentially set up the steal we need. We have a center line guard. It protects the pin and the area directly in front of the pin, which means that at some point, not always on the second shot of the end, but certainly at some point, we have the opportunity to throw that guard, to throw around that guard, and set up our steal. No matter what our game plan is, though, we're almost always going to be playing down that center line and not chasing things off the center line. The one exception would be if we have a big lead and the hammer team either accidentally or purposely throw something into the house that we're allowed to hit. We'll probably choose to hit it at that point because we always want to hit when we have a big lead and there is something that could potentially count that we can get rid of. One important thing to note is that when we are playing without the hammer, we generally want to play a little less risky than when we have the hammer. We need to be a little more aware of the situation that's going on in the house and how much danger we're in of giving up a big end. Even at the club level, most big ends tend to happen with the hammer. So in the situation I've laid out here, we're yellow and we don't have the hammer. And let's say it's the first end, no score. We're playing without the hammer and perhaps it's one of our vices rocks. A lot of new skips are tempted to try to guard this yellow rock again. And if you make the shot over and over again perfectly, this might work out for you where you end up stealing one, right? The problem is you're taking on a lot of risk just to steal that 1 point. If you ever over curl the guard or under curl the guard, depending on which way you're curling, I suppose, or if your guard is not good enough to prevent a come around tap, or if your guards are all wonderful and the hammer team happens to make this shot, not impossible, right? That goes. You're now in a situation where you're looking at giving up 3 or more points right out of the gate. Kind of a disaster, kind of what we're trying to avoid when we don't have the hammer. So while risk management is really going to be its own separate video, I thought it was important to cover here in the context of playing without the hammer, because you really can get yourself in trouble when you forget that without that last shot, you really can't afford to have only one rock in the house and leave your opponent sitting second, third, fourth, and fifth. Instead, in a situation like this, rather than guarding over and over again, at some point we may just be forced to start hitting things. And the only reason I went for the outside one is to maybe make the double on our yellows a little tougher. Maybe you roll in and you're sitting 1-2 anyway, and leave either not a double or a very tough double. And now the situation feels a lot more under control. You're not out of danger entirely yet, but now you're sitting 1-2 instead of just sitting that one, hoping and hoping that that one rock doesn't go away. All right, let's try switching now to talking about how we want to play with the hammer. With the hammer, in most ends, our goal is going to be to try to score 2 or more points. Of course, blanking is usually pretty good for us, unless maybe we're way behind. And taking 1 is not a disaster. You'll often hear it said that taking 1 is a win for the team without hammer. But in reality, a force is almost like the holding serve of curling. No real huge advantage to either side. It is more situational. If anything, it's an advantage to the team in the lead, regardless of who gets the 1, because then the team with the lead has taken an end off the board and either is getting the hammer back with a small or only slightly smaller lead than they had before, or giving up the hammer while having increased the lead they already had. Often early in the game, you won't even be afraid of giving up a steal of 1, because it'll feel a lot like forcing your opponent anyway, especially in that first end. It's still not good for you, but a steal of 1 early in the game, or sometimes in other key points, doesn't really hurt you that much, because while you're giving up 1 point, you are getting the hammer back again for the next end. Do be aware that this doesn't mean you can always give up steals of 1. They do add up and can put you into a serious hole. If you're already behind, a steal of 1 really does feel bad. Feels like you're digging yourself into a situation where you're going to have to get more and more aggressive to get back in the game. So what should our strategy be when we're playing with the hammer? Well, in a lot of ways, it's just the opposite of what our strategy is without the hammer. We want to keep the scoring area as large as possible, so as many of our rocks can count, ideally without them getting too clumped up where they can be removed in bunches. If we have a house where even our biters could be counting, and we can leave the opposing team with maybe only 1 rock we have to eliminate at the end to make everything count for us, that's a huge opportunity to score a big N. In general, this means that the hammer team really would prefer to play to the wings if possible. Unfortunately, in practice, because we're going second, while that is an advantage, the non-hammer team has a little bit of an ability to dictate that we should be playing in the center, depending on how they set up. When the team without hammer throws up that center line guard, it really is common for the hammer team to go right around it, despite the fact that we said we'd prefer to play to the wings and keep the scoring area very large. The problem is that center line guard really does draw the play to the middle of the sheet. And any of our other options other than going around it either feel very aggressive or like they give our opponents almost free rein to take control of the end. Here's what I mean. Let's say we are behind, but our opponents, deciding to play aggressively, want to throw up that center guard. Maybe we're only down a couple points and it's still quite early in the game. We might throw a corner guard because we know we want to get a corner guard up, right? We want to get our rocks in around a guard, and we prefer it to be in the corner. You can do this, but it's a very aggressive play because yellow will just come around their guard, and suddenly we are looking at a very strong setup for the team without hammer to steal, or at least threaten to steal, and perhaps force us to 1 point later once we clear out the center. If we follow that up by coming around our corner guard, for instance, just to illustrate the point, we do have the potential to get a couple, but we also have a big center to work out after they likely throw up a second guard. It could even be in the top of the house. It would effectively still be a second guard. We have a lot of work to do to make that second red rock count. Ends like this do happen, but they come with a lot of risk for both sides, and at the club level especially, not very easy for red to dig out of this if yellow makes all their shots. Well, how about if we just throw one in, but not behind the center guard? We go to the wing instead. This can be a reasonable shot in some circumstances, particularly if we're the ones with a really big lead. In that case, we'd rather not accidentally throw, say, a center guard that now makes it easier for the other team to set up a potential steal, which they need because we have a big lead. We also don't want to go a little deep and provide backing for them. And even if we go in the ideal spot, there's a good chance that either right away or after throwing a second guard, they'll follow us down, either tapping us or not, and at least have something set up where they have a rock that's very difficult to get rid of, very close to the button, and this gives them opportunities to try to steal, right? At some point, they'll try to hit their own yellow, probably pretty late in the end, remove that red backer, and suddenly be counting at least one. Maybe with us only having one shot to come back and outscore it. So with a big lead, it makes perfect sense for us to go to the corner still. But again, the non-hammer team will probably come around, and they will have a good chance to set up a steal or to at least threaten to get a steal here. The difference is we're okay with that as long as the end doesn't get entirely out of control, because we have a big lead and we just don't want to add anything to the center that'll make it worse. But we have to have a pretty big lead to feel that way, right? We have to be okay with them throwing, their third rock in play and then us finally getting to peel the center guard so that we can work our way back towards their rocks in the house. So that's why in most cases, when we're not in that situation, when there's not a huge lead for us and we don't want to get entirely 100% defensive, we're probably going to come around the center guard anyway. We get to that spot before our opponents, and we threaten to score one or more points. It is not a guaranteed deuce by any stretch, and there's more likelihood of us getting forced to one in this case than if we set up that corner guard that really sets up a traditional deuce. But we're still fighting for two or potentially more here, and we're taking on a lot less risk along the way. We're definitely not letting yellow just take control of the forefoot and then saying, hey, we'll peel our way out. Speaking of peels, one thing that even players and teams at the club level should get used to doing is peeling center guards when you get into some trouble in an end. When you have the hammer and you're in a position where, I'll even make this worse, and there's, say, two rocks on the forefoot, it's too late to be trying little come-arounds and freezes or anything else you might see here, or working to the sides of the ice. You have to do something about this yellow center that's building up. And the thing to do, of course, the most natural thing to do is to just hit this yellow rock out and roll away, open up the center of the sheet. There's at least two reasons to do this. The two big ones are, one, you may have the opportunity to go after those yellow rocks on a future shot if yellow doesn't continue making excellent guards on those rocks. And two, at the very least, you've kind of made sure that things don't get any worse and the end doesn't spiral out of control, right? If we do anything else but peel here and we miss, say we, do try some sort of come around and we go bop and roll off, yellow has the opportunity to throw another guard. And now we have even a tougher time getting at those yellow rocks. Potentially yellow could throw a third one in, start playing for a very big steal. There's just no reason to allow that unless we're losing and we absolutely have to take the most chances possible, in which case this end was shaping up pretty badly for us anyway, to be honest. But we probably would have to try something like, getting that corner freeze and hoping we could take care of those yellow rocks later. So those are some examples of how the non-hammer team might force you to play towards the center. But as I was saying earlier, really your preference should be to play to the wings, to keep rocks spread out, and to keep the scoring zone as large as possible. And there's a couple different ways in which we might get the chance to do that. First, we may have a situation where the non-hammer team has missed one or both of their early shots, which allows us to freely play to the corner and not even worry about them setting up a center. As an example, here's an end you'll see quite a bit at the club level when the other team throws in and does not get that guard up. They throw something towards the middle. We decide to hit it back. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly safe thing to do. We roll a little bit maybe. And on their second shot, the non-hammer team hits but rolls out. So now we're left with nothing to play, and it's our second shot. Unless we're up huge here, or it's an endgame situation, we're up enough where we're happy just to do nothing, the best play here is just to throw a corner guard. This corner guard is sort of a risk-free way of signaling that we're going to try to score our 2 points, right? We're not really afraid of yellow coming around there, especially this early in the end, because we could always follow it. Yellow also has no more free guards to throw, so if they try to throw a center guard, if we feel like we want to, we can peel it, or we can go around it, or we can go around our corner guard, our choice. And they're not allowed to peel our guard yet, so we're always going to have it there to potentially score. Just a very simple example of the idea of how when the yellow team doesn't get their setup, when the non-hammer team doesn't get their setup, we can pull play away from the center, just like they can pull play to the center. The only difference is that because they get the first opportunity to throw, they're more likely in more situations than not to pull play to the center. The other situation that comes up a lot is that we have hammer and we're losing by a couple points or late in the game, and the non-hammer team decides to play conservatively by just throwing in the house. Now, one of the most important lessons you can learn here is that if you're down late or you're down a lot, you do not want to hit that rock. Why? It's built on the lessons we've already been talking about. Sure, that hits are conservative, and if we hit and stick around anywhere, the other team can just hit us back, and all we're doing is wasting rocks, wasting opportunities to throw guards so there's places to hide, and shortening the end, leaving us with less time to now set something up and potentially score the points we need. So instead, if we put that rock back, we're once again going to be looking at throwing a corner guard. You'll hear some people talk at the club level about how players in club leagues and stuff don't tend to use their corner guards and that there isn't that much use in them. But this is one of the two situations, as I said in the earlier situation where you kind of get to do it for free, where it really makes sense and you're really going to have to try to use it, because there really isn't another option here to realistically play for 2 or more points if you need to. Probably the other option you'll see some people try, if they're thinking and they don't just hit and they do want to score 2, you'll sometimes see people come and try to freeze right to the yellow rock. Technically, this does improve your chances of getting 2, right? You have a rock that, if you make it perfectly, you have a rock that's very difficult to get rid of. There are 2 problems with this, though. First, while that rock's hard to get rid of directly, the other team is allowed to hit it right away. You've taken one of the opportunities you had to throw a guard, which in the long run is a safer bet for helping you get multiple points, and used it to throw a very difficult shot. And the problem is that they can hit this rock. And yellow very well might do that on their second rock. Hit it, lose their backer, leave you sitting 1, but with a rock that's very vulnerable to being eliminated, no guards, and it's going to be very difficult for you to find places to score a second point where you're not leaving doubles all day long for yellow, or ways for yellow to sit 2 and make it difficult for you to set up your deuce. Secondly, of course, if we put this rock back here, honestly, it's difficult to make this shot perfectly at any level, and especially at the club level. And if you corner freeze, boom, they're going to hit it out, most likely. If you bounce off, they will just hit it. If you're a little light, they may be able to chip it out. If you're a little heavy, you might end up back here. Actually, that might be, of the misses we've looked at, one of the better results, because at least it's back there, not so easy to get at, and could potentially be a second counter. But none of these are great, and none of them are as good as just throwing the guard up, giving yourself a place to hide. Yes, it's a little scary because probably if it's late and they're up a lot, the team without hammer will just throw a second one in and then perhaps guard after that. especially at the club level, or depending on how much you're down in the exact situation, they may even throw the guard first. And you're going to have to deal with that. But that comes with the territory of being down in the game, right? We're going to have to take a little bit of risk. We're going to have to play like we really need to and not just like we want to or choose a good outcome. We have to play like it's the only outcome or very close to that. For newer skips and newer players, you may be asking why I keep talking about the corner guard as being so important if you want to score 2 or more points. Well, here's a quick and dirty example, really simplified from what you'll probably see in a game, but imagine you have gotten your buried rock behind this corner guard. Excellent, you've done it, and now both teams have 1 rock left. It's very difficult at this point for the non-hammer team to stop you from scoring 2. There's nowhere for them that's great to hide. Maybe they could tuck something just behind here, or maybe outcount you on the corner there. But they're going to have to make a really great shot to prevent you from getting to deuce. And on your last shot, again, simplified, assuming they don't make anything great, you're likely to have one of 2 things left to you. You might have an open hit, where you hit it and you stick it for your 2 points. Or you may just have a draw, either open or to beat something in the wings, and draw in for your 2nd point. Obviously, real-world scenarios are usually not that simple, although you do see ends set up like that more than occasionally. But usually there's a little more fight going on. But that's the basic idea. The guard gives you a place to hide 1 rock, and then you can throw your final shot as the 2nd point, and there's your 2. It's worth remembering that it is valuable for us to play on the wings even if we don't have a guard up. There are times where you can set up a deuce in a situation where you have no guards. This frequently happens in club play, and you'll see ends end up developing like this, even at the highest level of the game sometimes, although they rarely look quite as simple as this. So in the situation we're looking at here, we have a rock on the side of the sheet, and there are no other relevant rocks in play. There are no center guards. We don't have any corner guards. And while there may be some rocks around the periphery that aren't really impacting the situation, so that makes this a much simplified version of that, this is the only rock, ours, that is really impacting the scoring. In this case, believe it or not, we are pretty well set up for 2, especially if we're getting towards the end of the end and we're on the last few rocks. All we have to do to get our deuce, in theory, is throw a rock about parallel on the other side of the house. You've seen this before, right? This is called splitting the house, and you've probably heard that term playing in games at your club before. What we're looking at here is we have 2 rocks that are parallel to each other or very close to parallel to each other and far apart across the ice in the house, which means that not only can they not be doubled immediately, it's also difficult for the other team to play a hit and roll off of one of them to get the rocks closer together and in a position where a double is likely on the next shot or a couple shots down the road. Ideally, we'll keep our rocks separated like this for the entire end, and on our last shot, we'll have a draw or a hit to get our deuce. There's one more important reason why we try to keep the center of the ice open when we have the hammer. Some people talk about this as though it's the main reason, and I don't think I'd go that far, but it definitely is important and comes up a lot when we play and are throwing last rocks. And the idea is that if we have to make a shot at the end for 1, which, although we're playing for 2 or more, frequently happens that we get forced and we have to take our 1 point, we want a shot that's as makeable as possible. And if we keep the center open, if we remove rocks from in front of the center line, then we make it very likely that we will either have a draw or an open hit on our last shot. If we look at the situation I've set up on the board here, of course, if you're in a situation like this in your last rock, you may feel a little nervous throwing the draw, but all you have to do is touch the 8-foot. You don't even have to touch the 8-foot. You have a lot of wide open space to work with, and I put one on the pin, but you don't even have to, and we usually don't. You have plenty of room to score your 1, and more times than not, especially after you have a year or 2 of experience under your belt, you'll make this shot to get your point. The other possibility is that instead of a open draw, they leave you with a rock there in the top 4 on the button, and in that case, you have an open hit instead. And you don't even have to throw that much weight, right? We can hit it with whatever weight's comfortable and pretty safe for us. We don't want a big roll, but even if we roll a few feet, as long as we remove the rock, we get our 1. So if we manage to play to the wings, if we can figure out a way to do that in the end without taking too much risk, and we keep the center open, there's a really good chance we'll score with the hammer, because it just makes it so hard for the non-hammer team to really put us under a lot of pressure going into our last shot. So there you go. There's just a little bit of information about how to play without and with the hammer. I hope that's been helpful. I'm going to continue doing this series over the weeks and months to come. If you have any comments of your own, if you have any tips for playing with the hammer or without the hammer you'd like to give other people, please leave a comment below. I'm sure there'll be some great discussion down there. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed watching it, subscribe to the channel, and like I said, check out the Patreon. Really appreciate anyone who supports the channel. Thanks for watching, and until next time, good curling.